On the night of December 6, 1991, four teenage girls were closing up a yogurt shop in Austin, Texas. They were 13, 15, and 17 years old. Two of them were sisters. Two of them were best friends. They had finished their shift, counted the register, and were getting ready to go home. It was a Friday night. It was December. They had the whole weekend ahead of them. They never made it out of that building. When a patrol officer spotted smoke coming from the "I can't believe it's yogurt" shop just before midnight, he called it in as a fire. Within minutes, firefighters arrived and knocked down the flames. And then, in the waterlogged wreckage of a small commercial yogurt shop in North Austin, they found four bodies. The girls had been bound with their own clothing. They had been shot in the head, and before the killer left, he had set the building on fire, deliberately, methodically, to destroy every trace of what he had done. What followed was one of the longest, most painful, most catastrophically mishandled murder investigations in American history. Four innocent men were arrested, interrogated, and two of them convicted, one of them sentenced to death for murders they did not commit. They spent years in prison. They lost everything. And the real killer spent the rest of his life moving from state to state, raping and murdering other women, completely free. He died in 1999, without ever being charged, without ever sitting in a courtroom, without ever having to look a single family in the eye. And then, in September 2025, 34 years after the night those four girls were killed, a detective working alone on a cold case submitted a single bullet casing to a ballistics database. And Amy Ayers finally got to speak. Amy was 13 years old. She was the youngest of the four. And in the final moments of her life, as the killer attacked her, she fought back. She scratched him. She clawed at him. She left his DNA underneath her fingernails. And for 34 years, that DNA sat in an evidence bag in a lab, waiting for science to catch up with the truth. This is the complete story of the yogurt shop murders. And it will stay with you for a long time after this video ends. Austin, Texas in 1991 was a city in the middle of becoming something. It was not yet the booming tech hub it would later grow into. It was a mid-sized university city with a strong music scene, a relaxed atmosphere, and the kind of community where people felt safe enough to let their teenagers work late shifts at local businesses without too much worry. I can't believe it's yogurt shop on West Anderson Lane was exactly that kind of place. Ordinary. Local. The kind of business that existed in hundreds of American suburbs, staffed by high school kids on weekend evenings. Eliza Thomas was 17 years old. She had a shift that Friday night along with her friend Jennifer Harbison, also 17. At some point in the evening, Jennifer's younger sister Sarah, 15 years old, and their mutual friend Amy Ayers, just 13, came to the shop to meet them. They would all go home together when the shift ended. What happened inside that building in the hours that followed has never been fully reconstructed. The fire destroyed too much. But what investigators established from the physical evidence was enough to understand the horror of those final hours. The girls had been restrained. They had been subjected to violence. They had been shot, each one of them in the head. And the building had been set ablaze by someone who wanted to make sure that nothing survived. The first detective to arrive on scene that night was John Jones. A local television news crew happened to be riding along with him, filming a routine segment, and captured on camera the moment his radio crackled with the news that the fire had become something else. You can hear on that footage the dispatcher saying the words robbery and homicide. You can hear Jones acknowledge it. And then you can hear him ask how many victims. The dispatcher said 3. Jones said he was en route. Then the radio crackled again. A fourth body had been found. In the days that followed, the city of Austin went through the particular kind of grief that descends on a community when something happens that it cannot process. 4 teenage girls. A yogurt shop. Friday night. There's no framework for it. There's no way to make it make sense. And the pressure on investigators to find answers, quickly, publicly, decisively, was immense. That pressure, it would turn out, was part of the reason the next 30 years went so terribly wrong. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, investigators had almost nothing to work with. The fire had done its job. Much of the physical evidence at the scene had been compromised or destroyed. Investigators had some DNA samples collected from the victims during autopsies, but the technology available in 1991 was not sophisticated enough to produce a usable identification from what they had. They had eyewitness reports of two suspicious men seen in the shop earlier in the evening. They had a general description. They had no names. For years, the case went cold. Leads came in and led nowhere. The families of the four girls lived in a limbo that the families of murder victims know well. The specific torture of a case that stays open, that has no answers, that forces you to keep reliving the worst night of your life without ever arriving at anything that feels like resolution. Then, in 1999, 8 years after the murders, investigators took a new run at the case. 4 young men were brought in for questioning. Their names were Maurice Pierce, Forrest Wellborn, Robert Springsteen, and Michael Scott. All 4 had been teenagers in Austin at the time of the murders. All 4 had some peripheral connection to the social circles that investigators had been examining. All 4 were subjected to extended interrogation sessions. Maurice Pierce and Forrest Wellborn did not confess. Charges against them were eventually dropped due to lack of evidence. Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott were different. After hours of interrogation, many of those hours unrecorded, both young men gave confessions. They implicated each other. They described details of the crime, and investigators, under enormous pressure to close a case that had haunted the city for nearly a decade, accepted those confessions as the foundation of their prosecution. Both men went to trial. Both were convicted. Robert Springsteen was sentenced to death. Michael Scott was sentenced to life in prison. 2 young men, convicted of capital murder, based almost entirely on their own words they would both later say had been extracted through coercion, through psychological manipulation, through hours of isolation and pressure that had broken them down until they said whatever they believed the investigators needed to hear. But here is the detail that should have stopped everything in its tracks from the very beginning. Neither Springsteen's confession nor Scott's confession matched the physical evidence at the crime scene in several critical ways. A detective who was present at the interrogations had previously been accused of coercing false confessions in another case, a case that had resulted in wrongful convictions that were later overturned. And crucially, neither man's DNA matched the samples collected from the victims. That last fact was not fully established until years later, when new DNA testing technology arrived and was applied to the evidence. But when it was established, it changed everything. The unknown male DNA profile extracted from vaginal swabs taken from 3 of the victims did not match Springsteen. It did not match Scott. It did not match Pierce or Wellborn. It did not match anyone who had ever been investigated in connection with this case. In 2009, after convictions had already been overturned on constitutional grounds, the 2 men had been denied the right to confront each other's confessions in court. The Travis County District Attorney dropped all charges. Springsteen and Scott walked out of the Travis County Jail on a June afternoon in 2009. They had spent nearly a decade behind bars for murders they did not commit. But here is where the injustice deepens in a way that is almost impossible to believe. Because the state of Texas refused to formally exonerate them, they were released, but they were not declared innocent. For the next 16 years, Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott lived in a legal limbo, not convicted but not cleared, unable to fully rebuild their lives under the shadow of a capital murder charge that had never been formally resolved, unable to access the compensation that Texas law provides to wrongfully convicted individuals because the court had ruled they had not proven their innocence. 4 teenage girls murdered, 2 innocent men imprisoned for a decade. And the real killer, whoever he was, still out there. It would take another 16 years, a single dedicated detective, a bullet casing found in a drain, and the DNA left under a 13-year-old girl's fingernails to finally bring the truth to light. In 2022, a detective named Daniel Jackson was assigned to the yogurt shop cold case. He was not the first investigator to take a fresh run at it. Over the 31 years since the murders, dozens of people had worked the case in various capacities, chased leads, run DNA comparisons, and come up empty. The case had developed a reputation within law enforcement as one of the most intractable cold cases in Texas history, not because investigators weren't trying, but because the available technology had simply not been capable of extracting a usable identification from the evidence that existed. Jackson approached it differently. Rather than focusing on the DNA profiles that investigators already had, he began looking systematically at every piece of physical evidence that had been collected at the scene in 1991, specifically looking for anything that had not been submitted to the most current available databases or tested with the most recent technology. In June 2025, he found it. A .380 caliber cartridge casing had been recovered from a drain inside the yogurt shop on the night of the fire. It had been cataloged and stored, but it had not been recently submitted to NEBIN, the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, a federal database that links firearms to crimes by analyzing the unique markings that a gun's firing mechanism leaves on bullet casings. The software used by NEBIN had improved dramatically in the years since the casing was last submitted. Jackson decided to resubmit it. In July 2025, he received a result that he had not expected. The casing matched a bullet casing from an unsolved murder in Kentucky in 1998. A different crime, a different state 7 years after the yogurt shop murders, but the same gun. Jackson reached out to investigators in Kentucky. The cases shared striking similarities in methodology. The same organized approach to controlling victims. The same use of binding. The same willingness to use fire. This was not a copycat. This was a pattern. Jackson then turned to the DNA. Working with forensic specialists, he identified a YSTR DNA profile that investigators had developed from samples taken from 3 of the victims, a partial male profile that had never matched anyone in existing databases. YSTR testing analyzes the Y chromosome, which passes directly from father to son, making it possible to identify a suspect's male lineage even from degraded or partial samples. Jackson sent the profile to every DNA lab in the United States that maintained a YSTR database, asking them to manually search it against their records. Only one lab responded with a match. The South Carolina State Law Enforcement Division came back with a name. The YSTR profile from the yogurt shop victims matched a profile in their records, a profile connected to a 1990 sexual assault and murder in Greenville, South Carolina. The name attached to that profile was Robert Eugene Brasher's. Jackson pulled everything available on Brasher's, and what he found was a portrait of a man who had been moving through the American South and Midwest for nearly a decade, leaving a trail of sexual assaults, murders, and destroyed lives in multiple states, while law enforcement in each jurisdiction had no idea he was connected to anything beyond the crime directly in front of them. Brasher's had served prison time for shooting a woman before the yogurt shop murders. He had been released on parole in 1989, 2 years before the killings. After the murders, he had continued. There was a murder in South Carolina, a murder in Missouri, an unsolved assault in Kentucky connected by the same gun. DNA links to sexual assaults and murders across the country that he had never been charged for. And then, in 1999, law enforcement had caught up with him in Missouri. Rather than face arrest, Robert Eugene Brasher's had pointed his gun at himself. The weapon he used to die, a .380 pistol, was confirmed to be the same weapon he had carried in 1991. The serial numbers matched the gun. The ballistics matched the casing from the drain. And the DNA under Amy Ayer's fingernails, the DNA left there when that 13-year-old girl refused to stop fighting in the final moments of her life, matched Robert Eugene Brasher's directly. Jackson stood before the families of the 4 girls in September 2025 and told them what 34 years of waiting had finally produced. He said it was Amy's fighting back that solved this case. He said her final moments on this earth were to solve this case for us. He said he was sorry it had taken so long. And then he said it was because of her that they were finally, after all of it, here. Robert Eugene Brashears was not a man who appeared in any true crime documentary before 2025. He was not a household name. He was not a case study in any textbook. For 34 years, he existed only as an unknown DNA profile sitting in an evidence bag, a partial biological signature with no face attached to it, no name, no history. What the investigation into his background revealed was a history of violence that stretched back further than the yogurt shop murders and continued well beyond them. He had committed his first known murder in 1990 in Greenville, South Carolina, a sexual assault and killing that had gone unsolved for decades until his DNA profile finally surfaced in the 2025 investigation. After the yogurt shop murders in December 1991, he had been stopped by Border Patrol just 48 hours later, on December 8, 1991, at a checkpoint between El Paso, Texas and Las Cruces, New Mexico. He was driving a stolen car. He was in possession of a .380 pistol, the same pistol, confirmed by serial number, that he would later use in other crimes and ultimately to take his own life. He was not questioned in connection with the yogurt shop murders at that stop. He had not yet been identified as a suspect. The Border Patrol agents who stopped him had no reason to connect a man in a stolen car to a fire in a yogurt shop in Austin 2 days earlier. He was processed and released. And he kept going. Through the 1990s, Brashears continued operating. The Kentucky murder connected by the knee-beam ballistics hit in 2025. The DNA links to sexual assaults in multiple states. A modus operandi that investigators described as consistent and organized. The binding of victims, the control, the violence, the methodical destruction of evidence. This was not an impulsive criminal. This was a man who had developed a pattern and refined it over years. In 1999, investigators in Missouri caught up with him in connection with an unrelated crime. Rather than surrender, he turned his .380 pistol on himself. He died at the scene. For the next 26 years, nobody knew what he had done in Austin on December 6, 1991. The 4 families of the girls he had killed continued living with an open wound. Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott continued living with the shadow of convictions they had not deserved. And the case remained officially unsolved, one of the most haunting cold cases in Texas history. Until Daniel Jackson submitted a bullet casing to a database in the summer of 2025 and everything finally came apart. In September 2025, the Austin Police Department held a press conference at City Hall. The families of the 4 girls, some of them now in their 50s and 60s, having spent more than 3 decades carrying this, sat in the front rows. The Austin Police Chief Lisa Davis stood at the podium and called the case one of the most devastating and haunting in the city's history. Detective Daniel Jackson laid out the evidence in careful, methodical detail. The bullet casing, the Kentucky connection, the YSTR profile, the South Carolina match, the fingernail DNA, the name, Robert Eugene Brashears, deceased, September 1999. Sonora Thomas, who had been 13 years old when her sister Eliza was killed, the same age Amy Ayers had been, sat in that room and listened. She had spent 34 years waiting for a name. She had spent 34 years not knowing. And now she had it. Too late to prosecute. Too late for a trial. Too late for Brashears to sit in a courtroom and hear what he had taken from those 4 families and from that city. Amy Ayers' father spoke to reporters after the press conference. He was told that the DNA under his daughter's fingernails, the DNA she had put there in the final moments of her life, fighting back against a man twice her size, was what had ultimately identified the killer. He said he had never been so proud of his daughter in his life. He said he was sorry it had taken this long. And he said that Amy's final act on this earth had been to make sure the truth survived. In December 2025, the Travis County District Attorney's Office filed a motion to formally initiate the exoneration process for all 4 men who had been wrongfully accused. Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, Forrest Wellborn, On February 19, 2026, 34 years, 2 months, and 13 days after the night of the murders, the judge signed the order declaring all 4 men innocent. Not just released, not just cleared on a technicality. Innocent. For Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott, who had spent nearly a decade on death row and in prison respectively, who had been convicted on the basis of confessions their interrogators had squeezed out of them through hours of psychological pressure, who had been denied formal exoneration for 16 years after their release. That word carried a weight that is difficult to fully articulate. Attorneys for the men confirmed they are pursuing restitution under Texas law, which provides compensation of up to $80,000 for each year of wrongful imprisonment. They are also considering civil lawsuits. The question of how 2 young men ended up convicted of a crime for which there was never any physical evidence connecting them, how their confessions were accepted as sufficient proof of guilt when those confessions contradicted the crime scene in multiple ways, when the detective involved had a documented history of coercive interrogation tactics, when the DNA found on the victims had never matched them, is a question that the exoneration does not fully answer. It is also a question about the American justice system that goes well beyond this case. About what happens when the pressure to close a high-profile case collides with the rights of young men who do not have the resources to push back effectively. About how confession evidence without corroboration can carry a case to conviction even when everything else suggests it should not. About how many other Robert Springsteens and Michael Scotts are sitting in American prisons right now, convicted on words alone, waiting for technology to catch up with the truth. Outro. There are several things about the yogurt shop murders case that are impossible to let go of once you know them. There is the image of 4 teenage girls on a Friday night, closing up a yogurt shop, making plans for the weekend that they never got to have. There is the image of Amy Ayers at 13 years old, fighting back in the dark, leaving behind the evidence that would outlast the killer himself and eventually bring his name to light. There is the image of Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott walking out of the Travis County Jail in June 2009 after nearly a decade behind bars, one of them having sat on death row for something they did not do. Not fully exonerated. Not declared innocent. Just released into a world that still officially considered them suspects, carrying a weight that no amount of compensation will ever fully lift. And there is the image of Robert Eugene Brashers, stopped at a Border Patrol checkpoint 48 hours after killing 4 teenagers, driving a stolen car, carrying the murder weapon, being waved through, and sent on his way to spend another 8 years killing people before anyone ever connected the dots. 34 years. For innocent men. A killer who died free. And a 13-year-old girl whose last act of defiance, in the final moments of her life, ultimately wrote the last chapter of the story. Detective Daniel Jackson said something at that September 2025 press conference that deserves to be the last word here. He said this was something that could not have happened until 2025. That the science simply did not exist until now. And he said he was sorry it had taken 34 years to get there. But he also said they were there. Finally. Because Amy had made sure of it. If this case affected you, if there is a detail in this story that you cannot stop thinking about, leave it in the comments below. Tell me what part of this hit hardest. And if you want more true crime documentaries with real depth, real justice, and real stories that deserve to be told properly, subscribe right now so you never miss what comes next.